Okay, hello and good afternoon, everyone. And a warm welcome to the second event in the AQUACOSM-plus webinar series on grand challenges in aquatic ecology. My name is Ulrich Liebesel, and I'm a biological oceanographer at GEOMAR in Kiel, and I will be your moderator for this event. The event this afternoon consists of two parts. The first part will be an incentive talk by Professor Andreas Oschlies, and directly afterwards there will be a World Café on ocean-based CO2 removal strategies, so on the same topic that Andreas will present on. I should let you know, and you've probably already seen the message, the first part, the incentive talk by Andreas, and the questions and answers that follow right after will be recorded. So if you ask questions, be aware that they will be included in the recording. The second part, the World Café, will be completely offline, not recorded. So this will hopefully allow for an open discussion where you should feel free to also make controversial statements if you like. I should let you know that you are welcome to phrase questions in the question and answer section of Zoom. So even during the talk of Andreas, feel free to put your questions online, and I will read them later on to Andreas, or if you would prefer to ask them directly, we will see if time allows afterwards. So not to cut into Andreas' time too much, let me briefly introduce him. Andreas studied physics in Heidelberg and Cambridge. He did a PhD in physical oceanography in Kiel. He then worked as a research scientist in Toulouse and in Kiel, and he then took up a professorship at the National Oceanographic Center in Southampton. And since 2006, he is professor of marine biogeochemical modeling at Kiel University and head of the research unit biogeochemical modeling at GEOMAR. His research focus is on physical, biogeochemical, and ecological modeling, spanning the broad range from ecosystem processes to global biogeochemical cycling and Earth system feedbacks. Related to his presentation today, I should mention that Andreas was coordinator, or still is coordinator, of the priority program, the German Research Foundation program Climate Engineering, Risks, Challenges and Opportunities, so directly related to today's presentation. And he's also involved in assessments of climate engineering proposals. So the topic of today's event is very much to the heart of his interest. And without further ado, I hand over to Andreas and look forward to his presentation. Thank you, Andreas, for agreeing to present here.
Yeah, thanks all for the introductions. Thanks to everybody to make it to this online webinar, which is unfortunate that we can't meet in person. I'd have very much preferred this. And so this presentation is about, well, necessary things we have to do to meet the promised climate Paris Agreement. This already was agreed almost 5 years ago, and not very much has happened in terms of climate and after that. But we will see we have obligations, and we will have to discuss a few issues, in particular carbon dioxide removal, that will be necessary to meet the promised goals. The goals are to keep temperature increase to well below 2 degrees, and if possible below 1.5 degrees. Also, this is a new quality of this agreement, wasn't discussed in any previous agreements, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as rapidly as possible. So the first new term is reduce, not only slow down the increase, and as rapidly as possible. This is a new quality. And another new quality, maybe even more important, is we have promised, or signature states have promised to achieve net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases in the second half of the century. And while the official term is to balance sources and sinks of greenhouse gases. And all this should happen in the context of sustainable development, fight of hunger, poverty, injustice, and so on. This is not trivial, and what really connects nicely these two aspects, reducing or limiting warming to less than 2 degrees, and if possible less than 1.5 degrees, and achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, comes from this scientific observation that there's a tight relationship between CO2 emissions and global warming. On the x-axis here, you see the cumulative CO2 emissions since the beginning of the pre-industrial evolution. And on the vertical axis is the warming since the same period. And you see a pretty close one-to-one, well, on this scale, at least one-to-one relationship, a linear relationship. That means the further you go to the right, the more you emit, the more CO2 in this case. CO2 is the most critical greenhouse gas because it has the longest residence time and it doesn't just go away like methane or nitrous oxide, which have a much shorter lifetime. And so the cumulative emissions determine the warming since pre-industrial times. And if we agree on, for example, 1.5 degrees, as has been written down and agreed upon as a goal, at least in the Paris Agreement, then we can infer how much CO2 can be emitted. So there's some uncertainty range, but it's clear we have a limit of total cumulative emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution. If we go to 2 degrees, of course a little warmer, then we have a little more space or larger budget that we can emit in terms of CO2. And this is the leverage we have. We can discuss the warming, degree of warming, and on the vertical axis. And this tells us how much CO2 we can emit or how much fossil fuels we can burn. It's also clear that at whatever temperatures we agree we will stop, 2 degrees, 3, 4 degrees, however warm we will let the planet heat up, it will in the end require net zero CO2 emissions. So at some stage, if we want to stop warming, there's no way we have to stop CO2 emissions completely, or at least have a net zero emission world. That means any emissions that we still have to be compensated by CO2 removal. Otherwise, the planet will go warming will go on forever. And that's, of course, not very good. So this is a clear message from science, and that has been taken up by the Paris Agreement in this third point to come to net zero CO2 emissions in the second half of the century. And this is what all the governments, or 192 governments so far, have promised. So this is a legal agreement. And now the governments have asked the scientists back, how can we achieve that what we have already promised? And this has been done prior to the special report, IPCC special report. So that was a request by the governments to the IPCC to tell politicians what can be done to achieve the already promised goals. And one clear message that comes out of this is summarized in this nice graph from Anderson Peters, 2016, 1 year after the Paris Agreement and at the beginning of the IPCC special report process. And so this is the median of all IPCC scenarios, or scenarios discussed in the IPCC report and last full assessment, report 5. All scenarios that achieve a 2-degree warming goal, not 1.5 degree, but 2 degree, the more pessimistic or maybe more realistic one. This 2016 paper shows the net emission curve, and it also shows already it crosses zero, so that's a net zero will be reached in around 2070 here in this median scenario. After that, there's a net negative emissions. So this is CO2 is constantly removed from the atmosphere. And we will discuss later how this could be done. This looks at least plausible. What is problematic? Of course, there will be some remaining positive CO2 emissions all the time that we can imagine, at least. So we will produce steel, cement probably, and agriculture will emit greenhouse gases, so CO2 equivalents, particularly via fertilizers. There will be some heavy transport. Flights probably will emit CO2. So there will be positive emissions, and these have to be compensated by even more negative emissions. So these negative emissions are everything here below the zero line is what has to be taken out of the atmosphere this century. How much is this? If we do the integral here, this turns up to be 670 gigatons. So this is also in the IPCC report, not the special report. It's slightly higher for 1.5 degree world. And this is a lot. It's more than all the historical emissions of the US and China taken together, all the emissions they have done over the last centuries until now. And this is the equivalent that has to be taken out of the atmosphere this century, so the next 80 years. Of course, it gets slightly worse since 2015. Not that much has happened, and even Corona hasn't helped that much in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. And so we are now further above this curve. And this makes, of course, the requirement for negative emissions even larger. The second critical part or point to notice here is that these negative emissions, they start to be significant 1 billion ton per CO2 per year already in 10 years' time. This is very soon. So if we want to have a big infrastructure running by then, we better start now developing these mechanisms, these schemes that can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And we think about how we get permits, how we get a consensus, how this should be done, who's responsible, who has to agree. Does it need a world democracy? Then we will not achieve it in 10 years' time. Or can we partition that into smaller contributions from individual states that have to deal with their legal arrangements? But this is not trivial, and right now we don't have any roadmap at all, I would say, how to achieve this, how to get this started at a big scale, 1 billion tons CO2 per year. So this is more than all Germany emits per year. That will have to be taken up per year on a global scale, of course, but it's a lot of CO2, and this has to be removed and stored safely. How can this be done? So there's a number of ideas. This is a schematic we have come up with in our priority program, and Rita Erwin has done the nice graphics. So all these in this red encircled area are carbon dioxide removal techniques. What has been considered by IPCC so far are land-based methods, afforestation and bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. And this is all right, particularly for afforestation. We have a lot of experience with that for many 100 years. It doesn't cost a lot, at least in many regions. It's relatively cheap to plant trees, $5 per ton CO2. But there are some perceived co-benefits, at least in some areas where we like forests, and we can maybe even use wood or some products of forest. So that could be started within the next 10 years, and it is already started. So we do that. Whenever we try to fly CO2 neutral or do things, offset our emissions, usually trees are planted presently. And we hope that those trees will grow and live forever. Of course, this is not the case, but there are some problems. First, we need a lot of land. So if we want to do all this 670 gigatons of CO2, that was the target in this median scenario, this would mean a forest the size of Russia. And of course, we have limited land, so we don't produce any more land on the planet. It's there, and we do many other things on it, particularly agriculture. So this might quickly get in conflict with the sustainability goals. Forests need water, some nutrients as well, and we have to make sure they don't burn down or there are no pests killing the trees. And the last point here is the forests usually make the planet pretty dark. If you see satellite images, deserts are light, bright surface areas, the ocean is dark, and forests are dark. And in most climate models, afforestation of this scale leads to net warming. So there's more radiation taken up, solar radiation, shortwave radiation taken up than is compensated by reduced CO2. So the long wave effect that the CO2 addresses is smaller than the short wave, this albedo change, the color change that leads to a net warming. This is uncertain because of cloud issues. So usually often you have clouds above forests, and this is not a certain result, but an indication we have from models. It might be different in the real world. We don't really know this, but there's a high risk that forests may make the planet warmer, even though CO2 concentrations are reduced. So this would be a major side effect that we don't want. But the main social effect is, I think, this computation for land. And we have to realize we just can't afforest land the size of Russia. So afforestation alone is very unlikely to save the world and or save us to give us a route to deliver our promises in terms of climate, the Paris Agreement. The other one that is considered in the IPCC is bioenergy carbon capture storage. This would be basically power plants running with biofuels. This is not very expensive. It even delivers energy, so that's why we can make or reduce the cost basically by selling the energy. But again, it requires a lot of land. So for this scenario, if we would try to make up all our commitments by bioenergy carbon capture storage, we would need 2 times the size of India as biocrops. Again, competition for food and conflict with the sustainability goals. Another problem is this gray area here. You have to capture the emissions from the power plant and store that CO2 that is emitted from burning biofuels safely somewhere. And we don't have a good scheme how to do that at large scale. There are, of course, very good ideas, scientific ideas how to do this, underground storage of CO2, but it's not accepted in most societies. So in Germany, it's legally not allowed to store CO2 underground. And in many other countries, there are problems as well to do this. So this is really not an option. And both these methods discussed so far by the IPCC are unlikely to solve our climate problem or our problem to deliver the promised climate goals. And we have to look for other options. There are a few more options on land, enhanced weathering, biochar, and direct air capture. I don't want to discuss these here. They have high costs usually, limited potential. Enhanced weathering on land, this looks very promising, I think, but again has some conflicts of land use or potential conflicts with land use with other land use options we have. And that brings me to the ocean. So this hasn't been really considered in the IPCC world, but if you look at the planet, it's mostly ocean. And the ocean stores a lot of carbon already, so about 60 times of the atmospheric content. And why not use the ocean in this difficult problem to reach the climate goals. And that's what I would like to discuss here in these, well, 5 options briefly. First one is Southern Ocean iron fertilization. This has been studied a lot. There have been field experiments from the German icebreaker Polarstern in 2009. This was probably the last real scientific experiment. And the idea is to put iron, a micronutrient, into ocean areas that are limited, or where we think primary production is limited by this micronutrient iron. This is usually far away from the coast, and then it's mostly the Southern Ocean that is limited most by iron. That's according to ship experiments and field experiments that have been performed many times. And there the idea was studied at larger scale with these mesoscale fertilization experiments. And we have here in the global model assumed or tested what would happen if we fertilize the entire ocean all year round, at least, or the growing season around. And we see that what happens in our model, at least, is enhanced production. So this goes up by well, almost doubles. So it's 100% increase. So there, iron fertilizes, enhances production. That's what it was meant to do. What we also see, there are side effects, remote effects. Production goes down almost everywhere else, and that's because the enhanced production in the Southern Ocean consumes not only the added iron but also phosphate, nitrate, the macronutrients, and that will lead to reduced availability of macronutrients almost everywhere else in the global ocean. So this is here after 80 years of continuous fertilization. So one sees remote effects all over the southern hemisphere. And the longer we do it, the further north the signal, these side effects of reduced production propagate. So in the end, then fishermen of Peru may argue they have less productivity and therefore less fish because of Southern Ocean iron fertilization. So these are non-local conflicts that may arise that have to be considered carefully before you start such an operation in reality. In a model, you can do it without harming people, but in the real world, this has to be thought through before such an initiative is started at the large global scale. How much? Well, if we want to start it, we have to know how much it could contribute to our problem of addressing these well, CO2 removal target of 670 gigatons, so all the historical emissions of the US and China together. And what iron fertilization could contribute is not that much. What we see here in our model, surprisingly, is the maximum amount we can envisage is a few gigatons. This is carbon, so that would be about 10, 15 to 20 gigatons CO2 per year. But it's only a very short peak at the beginning of our operation here. And then the potential declines quickly. So there's a saturation effect, and it's very, very difficult to draw down more CO2. This is mostly because of the slowness of the ocean circulation. And so the ocean has to upwell new water, new phosphate and nitrate, and remove the water that has been fertilized and the remineralization products of the biology. So there's some limitation given by the speed of the ocean overturning circulation. So the long-term potential is pretty small. It's still a few hundred gigatons, but it's not as much as we had hoped. A second problem is whenever you stop fertilizing the Southern Ocean, much of the sequestered carbon will return to the surface very quickly and will gas out via the Southern Ocean. And this is here the dashed line where we have stopped fertilizing in year 2500, so pretty far away in the future. but we see a similar, very similar signal whenever we stop, even after 10 years, after 20 years, after 100 years. We see a rapid reversal, rapid outgassing. So this CO2 uptake becomes negative here on this plot. And then a slower outgassing for several centuries. And if we look at the total budget, we see that after 500 years, only about 40% of the initially sequestered carbon stays in the ocean. So there's a high leakage. Whenever you stop fertilizing, you have a high leakage of CO2 back to the atmosphere. This might be all right if we just want to shave a peak of global warming, but still this has to be taken into account. And usually we don't like solutions where we have really a burden on future generations that will then have either to maintain iron fertilization forever or live with the outgassing that comes from terminating iron fertilization. So this has to be taken into account. So the positive things about iron fertilization, yes, it does work. We have field experiments. There's a limited potential. Of course, there's effects about biodiversity. So a completely different algae will grow if you fertilize them. The same happens in your garden when you put fertilizer there. There's a community shift, and that could be viewed positively or negatively. But well, different people will have different views about this. And this has to be argued and has to be agreed upon, whether we want it or not. Costs may be relatively low. Southern Ocean is not always a pleasant place to work, so this might be difficult. And one positive thing here is we have a governance scheme already in place, the London Convention. So this is the first marine governance board, really, that deals with ocean iron fertilization. But this might be a prime example how we can do this, or at least govern other marine geoengineering or carbon dioxide removal techniques as well. So if you want to look at governance, look at the London Convention and iron fertilization. It's a very good example, I think, how society can come to international agreements, how this should be done or should not be done. Right now, the London Convention says iron fertilization should not be done except for research, small-scale research. But at least this is a convention that can be changed by, there are meetings every year, so governments can put in requests to change it, and this is possible. It's like a constitution you have that can be changed as well. The negative effects, well, there are these local and non-local shifts. So fishermen of Peru may blame iron fertilization if they catch less fish in the future. There's, of course, the fate of organic matter. Enhanced primary production will lead to enhanced mineralization, respiration, and enhanced oxygen consumption, and the high leakage rate. If you don't want to go via biology, which might be easier in terms of acceptance issues, so usually biodiversity is a pretty hard block. If you want to change things, there's resistance if you change biodiversity. There's the idea, why not pump CO2 directly as liquid CO2 into the deep ocean? That's in the end the fate where iron fertilization, if it works, puts it as well. So by export of organic matter and mineralization, it moves CO2 from the atmosphere into the deep ocean. And some physical process here is build a pipeline and pump CO2 directly into the deep water. This is also treated by the London Convention. It's currently not allowed. But again, that could be changed. We have a legal instrument, at least, that people can, and governments, politicians, societies can deal with. Now, what we have done here, we have simulated direct injection at the depth of 3,000 meters, different places, usually near industrial areas. And the red color here is the carbon stored in the ocean. So we see in the deep ocean, we can store a lot of carbon. We see, if you look at the red line here, we run injection experiments for 100 years, 2020 to 2120. and then let go, see how quickly would this leak out. We start with 100% here during injection. And after, well, about 500 years, we have still 60% of the CO2 injected is still in the ocean. So it's better than the 40% we had with iron fertilization, because, well, iron fertilization doesn't always reach 3,000 meters. The realization curve is usually shallower, and most of the carbon and CO2 will deposit it at shallower depth. If we directly inject at 3,000 meters, that is safer in terms of total permanence, and there's therefore a smaller leakage. The leakage comes about by the overturning circulation of the ocean. In the end, all the deep water is returned, will be returned to the surface. And but still, if we want to keep as much carbon or CO2 in the ocean, it might be better to directly inject it than go via biological process, via the biological pump, because the biological pump still realizes most of the carbon closer to the surface. And if you put a pipeline down to 3,000 meters, this might be much more efficient, at least in a global perspective. Another advantage is deeper than 3,000 meters, CO2 is denser than seawater. So if there's any problem, it will sink rather than rise to the surface. So this is a self-healing process. Whenever you have a bubble of CO2 there, you can be sure, don't worry, it will sink down. It's denser than seawater. We have this governance scheme in place, and it affects not the surface ocean biology. Of course, it will affect the deep ocean biology, so there's a problematic effect here. It will be lethal to most organisms close to the release points. And still, the leakage rate is far from zero. It's 40% within 500 years. Not ideal, but it might help to shave a peak of emissions. So conclusion here is iron fertilization. Well, the potential is about 1 gigaton carbon, so about 4 gigaton CO2 per year. So it's not sufficient to meet our promised climate targets, and it can't run forever. It has this 1 gigaton per year is only for the first century, and it will then saturate. And the high leakage rate is a problem. Direct injection is probably a little better in terms of CO2, but also not a very good way because of these high leakage rates and non-permanence issues. The next method I would like to discuss is ocean alkalinity enhancement. So this is a now chemical process. We've looked at biological process, iron fertilization, and physical process, directly pumping liquid CO2 into the deep ocean. And now we start addressing chemistry, the third natural science here involved. And this is very close to enhanced weathering on land. So that's what happens continuously on the planet. New rocks are exposed to CO2 or carbonic acid. And all these rocks react with the carbonic acid, essentially by consuming protons, H+. This shifts the carbonate chemistry away from CO2, dissolved CO2, to carbonate and bicarbonate ions. And so this shifts it away from the gas phase, CO2, to the ions. So they don't have a gas phase, carbonate and bicarbonate ions. And thereby we lock the CO2 away from this gas phase into the dissolved ions. So this is what the planet Earth does all the time. And this is what we think, what we know has kept the planet habitable for 4 billion years, or at least they allowed it to have a temperature range between 0 and 100 degrees to allow for liquid water existence and allow the evolution of life. If CO2 is removed by, well, essentially dissolving rocks now not on land where new outcrops, new mountains are formed, but by grinding rocks, producing rock powder, moving that into the ocean, into the surface ocean, where it is in direct gas exchange with the atmosphere. The dissolution of these rocks consumes CO2, or consumes the protons, and they shift the CO2, the carbonate balance, away from CO2 to bicarbonate and carbonate ions. So there's less dissolved CO2 on the surface waters, and more CO2 can be taken up from the atmosphere. And this is the essential of ocean alkalization, the essential functioning. You dissolve rocks in surface ocean water. How does it, what is the potential? The potential is huge if you have enough rock. The problem is the amount of rock. You need about 1 ton of rock per ton CO2 you want to remove. So you have to dissolve 1 ton of rock per ton CO2. Each of us in Germany, in Europe, we produce about 10 tons CO2 per year. So you would have to resolve, each of us, 10 tons rock per year. You can do that in your garden, on your balcony, and let it react with rainwater, and then make sure all this water in the end will be via the river network in the end up in the ocean. Or you could ship these 10 tons of rock to the ocean and dissolve it there. It's a huge operation. You need a lot of heavy weight trucks or lorries, and you have to, well, mine a lot of rock. The total amount of our current emissions would be 2 times the Matterhorn each year. So of course, we don't want to do that, and would be not go down well with the Swiss. So we have to check for some other rock types, other locations, and of course, make sure we reduce this amount as far as possible. It's likely that we can reduce emissions by about 80% in the next few decades. And that means there's not really, in the end, not 2 times the Matterhorn, but maybe 0.2 to 0.4 times the Matterhorn. So 20% of our current emissions are will likely have to be compensated by negative emissions by carbon dioxide removal. It's still a lot of rock, and there may be a lot of other problems rather than mining and transporting and dissolving. What is the positive about this? First is Earth has done this all the time on the planet the last 4 billion years at least. And there's a huge theoretical potential. So it's easy to, or it would be easy for the planet to really remove all our anthropogenic emissions via enhanced weathering. And that's what in our Earth system models the planet will do. It only takes too long. The natural weathering is 100 times slower than we really need it. And so it would need many thousand, if not 10,000, 100,000 years in the end to fully compensate our anthropogenic CO2 emissions. But in the end, weathering will do it, and the ocean will absorb all these carbonate, bicarbonate ions. There's no storage problem. This storage is essentially permanent. It's not fully permanent because of carbonate compensation, so there's less dissolution of carbonate rocks, of corals in the ocean if you put in a lot of alkalinity. But overall, the leakage is tiny compared to direct injection and ocean ion fertilization that we have considered so far. So we call it essentially permanent storage. The costs are pretty high, or medium to high, $40 to maybe $300 per ton CO2. So again, going back to your average 10-ton CO2 emissions per year, you can then compute it's maybe a few $1,000s per year that you have to pay. But it's still, at least for rich countries, this should be possible. A real problem is that the ecological effects are mostly unknown. We don't know what happens if you dissolve such a large quantity of rock. And well, there are side effects via chemicals, impurities in the rocks, heavy metals, in many silicated rocks at least. There may be physical effects, rock, dust, that might be a source for phytoplankton to attach to. Zooplankton might graze on it. So there may be many ecological effects that we don't know very well yet. Radiative effects, we change the color of the water or the light penetration. And these are things that have to be studied and explored. The second to last method I would like to discuss is another physical method. Well, before summarizing and comparing the different methods, is artificial upwelling. And this has been studied quite a bit in computer simulations with Earth system models. That's what we have done, but also in field experiments. Here's a few figures or photographs from one field trial off Hawaii, where a pipe, as a plastic pipe or tube, has been deployed with flap valves inside that ensure that the wave motion moves water inside the pipe upwards. The idea is that in contrast to iron fertilization, where you fertilize the ocean from above by deploying iron or iron sulfate as from a ship or from usually a ship, here the ocean is fertilized from below. So nutrients from the deeper ocean, where nutrients accumulate because of all the marine carbon pump and mineralization products at depth, will be brought from the ocean interior up to the surface to fertilize the surface ocean in the lightlet layer. So phytoplankton can thrive, can take up CO2. Some of this will sink and export carbon to the deep ocean. So fertilization that has different issues, also legal issues, than iron fertilization. You don't put anything new into the ocean, you just redistribute what is already in the ocean. But legally, this is a huge difference. So it might be much easier to get permits for artificial upwelling, so for redistributing water parcels within the ocean, than for dumping iron into the ocean, for example. So this makes it pretty attractive. What makes it attractive as well is that you might not need a lot of energy. So waves can pump up water. So that has been demonstrated in this field experiment. Didn't go very well. This tube was destroyed after several days because of wave action. And so there are other ideas to have more robust types of pipes or tubes to form the vehicle for artificial upwelling. Also other ideas for the energy supply. But in the end, energy doesn't seem to be the major problem. The major problem is usually the lifetime of these pipes that have to be resistant to and survive wave action. What happens if you then really upwell nutrient-rich waters? We have done this in models, and we have seen, the main effect really is that the upwelled water is colder, so it cools the ocean surface and the atmosphere. This was a side effect we didn't really account for initially, and we didn't really have on our books when we started our simulations. The upwelling of nutrients was also effective, so it did trigger more nutrient production, more biological production on the surface layer, but it just compensated for the additional dissolved inorganic carbon that was upwelled. Since whenever you upwell nutrients, you upwell mineralization products, and these mineralization products are also rich in CO2. So deeper waters hold more CO2, and upwelling those might not be always a good idea. So in the end, at least in a red field world, where the nutrient to carbon ratios stay constant, there's very little, if any, CO2 removal via artificial upwelling, because all the upwelled nutrients bring with them mineralized or respired CO2. And if you consume the nutrients in the surface layer, you just consume the upwelled CO2, but you don't have any net removal of anthropogenic CO2 from the atmosphere. And so the main effect we saw in our model simulations was that cooling, colder waters are upwelled. And this cools the surface ocean cools the atmosphere, and that's pretty nice. That's what we want. We want to cool the planet. And even if that doesn't absorb a lot of CO2, this was deemed a positive effect. So I have a few model results now here. This is 3 simulations. So one business as usual, the red curve. This is like a RCP 8.5 scenario. It will lead to rising CO2 over the century and rising temperatures. Our maximum Southern Ocean iron fertilization reduced CO2 a bit and reduced temperatures a bit by a few tenths of a degree. So not very much, but still it's a positive effect in the direction we want. Artificial upwelling also reduced CO2 a little more than iron fertilization, but reduced temperature by about 1 degree in these simulations. So this is a huge effect. We've not seen such a big temperature reduction by any other geoengineering method we investigated. And this looks at first sight very, very promising. However, what happens if we turn off these pipes? We see the temperature rises pretty rapidly. It rises even at levels higher than the red line here, the world where we have never done any artificial upwelling. So the planet, in the end, running artificial upwelling for 50 years and then stopping it, yields temperatures or a planet that is hotter than a planet where we had never tried artificial upwelling. And so this is a huge problem. When you try artificial upwelling for a while and then stop it, you end up at a hotter planet. It's not really sustainable, and is not what we want to inherit to future generations. So this result in the end means artificial upwelling has a huge termination, what we call termination effect. It basically hides heat. It moves heat into the deep ocean or deeper ocean. But this heat is all released back to the atmosphere once artificial upwelling is stopped. During the time these pipes run here in our model from 2020 to 2070, the surface ocean is colder. That's nice. That's what we would like to have. But this colder surface ocean emits less infrared energy into space. So the Earth loses less energy. And from outside, it looks like a colder planet. So radiation back into space is reduced. But solar radiation impinging on the Earth stays the same. So overall, the planet takes up more heat during operation of artificial upwelling. And part of this heat is then released back to the surface and heats the ocean surface and heats the overlying atmosphere once artificial upwelling is stopped. So this is it's a physical problem, basically, by hiding heat in the ocean interior and putting a cold lid of water to the surface by the colder artificial upwelling. And I compare that to basically cooling the Earth with an open fridge. You have the backside of the fridge where the heat is radiated away. And this is now turned by artificial upwelling into the deep ocean. But the open front door of the fridge is basically the upwelling, the upper ends of the pipes where you get cold water to the surface. And this cold water overlies warmer waters. The warmer waters are suppressed and moved slowly into the deep ocean. And this is not, I think, not a sustainable way.
Andreas, we would like to leave some time for questions. So maybe if you could come to an end in the next couple of minutes.
Good. So this is basically my stop sign against artificial upwelling. At least in its physical context, it's not sustainable. It really changes ocean stratification, heat stratification. And the last thing I would like to consider very briefly here is really, it's blue, what is called blue carbon. This is a relatively new field. It has gained, well, attraction because it has perceived positive side effects. It's salt marshes, seagrass meadows, mangrove forests, basically everything that grows in shallow areas of the ocean. You might, or some people call sargassum as well as blue carbon. This is, it's not well defined yet. So it's macroalgae, microscopic things that grow as a biological systems and grow in the ocean or at the ocean shore. These, of course, have huge ecological societal co-benefits. Usually they are viewed positively. They may not cost a lot, so rather you need protected areas where you ensure that these systems are not destroyed. And this has now gained traction in many countries. US, Australia has huge programs. And locally, this is very attractive. So it can store carbon. If you make sure that these mangrove forests really survive, they survive seagrass level, they survive climate change, sea level rise, and so on, then they are really beneficial. Unfortunately, the total storage potential is pretty limited. It's certainly less than 1 billion tons of CO2 per year. And there are these permanent issues. You have to make sure carbon stays there. These forests or salt marshes, seagrass meadows, they are not destroyed and they survive the still ongoing climate change. So the conclusion here, artificial upwelling, I have severe issues because of the physics. You disturb the stratification and in the end the overturning circulation of the ocean. Ion fertilization has limited potential, high leakage rates if you stop it. Direct injection is a little better than ion fertilization, and it circumvents the direct biological effects in the surface ocean. Ocean alkalinization, a chemical process, which even might counteract some parts of ocean acidification. If it really works, and if the side effects due to contaminants, heavy metals in the rocks, or physical effects of the rock powder on ecosystems are manageable, this, I think, has a high potential and might be even beneficial in many systems. So it might be better to dissolve rocks than let coral reefs dissolve in the acidifying ocean. And blue carbon is beneficial in many parts of the world, but has a limited potential, and we have to make sure that these are grown permanently and not destroyed by the next generation or by the next storm or rising sea levels. So the Earth system is robust in terms of whatever we do with most of these methods. We don't do harm, maybe except artificial upwelling, where we change certification, overturning circulation. But all other systems, they are at least reversible. When we stop ion fertilization, the CO2 comes out, but we don't do any net harm. We have to look at permanence issues of the carbon storage, and we particularly have to look at the ecology that is not yet well represented in models. We have to start very soon. So in 10 years' time, we have to be able to remove 1 billion tons of CO2 per year. Otherwise, we have little chance to reach the climate goals. And there's no alternative really other to hope for a miracle or catastrophe or humans die out or whatever, but this is not a sustainable societal action. And even COVID-19 now has reduced emissions this year probably by 8%. It's not enough, even if we have COVID-19 every year on top of the other until year 2050, we would not reach our climate goals. So we need more in terms of emission reductions than COVID-19. And this tells us emissions reductions alone is very, very unlikely to do it, at least not in a society we want to live in. So we have to address this CO2 removal from the atmosphere very quickly. And the ocean might offer a very large pool, a large storage space that we can address, I think. Thanks for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andreas, for a very nice overview on possible strategies for ocean-based CO2 emissions. I think you've clearly made the point that we have to look into the ocean to kind of solve the climate crisis, but also that there's an incredible amount of unknowns, uncertainties in potential, the side effects, the costs, and so on. So lots of room for research to be taken up on this. With this, I open the question and answer session, and we have a couple of questions already in our section here. The first one is by Bogdan Druga. He says, thanks for an interesting talk. How about using some of these 4 strategies, and you could probably say 5, together? Would their effect be cumulative so that more CO2 could be removed from the ocean as compared to each one individually? Andreas.
Well, yes, most of these, at least in the models, they are additive. So we think that we can combine biological effects, chemical and physical effects. It's difficult to combine different biological effects, since all biological systems use macronutrients as well. So there's competition for macronutrients, and that limits the additivity. So doing blue carbon, like growing a mangrove forest and macroalgae nearby, is probably not very efficient because you don't have enough macronutrients in the end. But you can combine chemical effects, so alkalinity enhancement and growing mangroves, probably easily. And maybe there's even synergetic effects in some instances. If you use like alkalinity enhancement to restore the carbonate system to pre-industrial levels, you may find it easier for some like coral reefs to grow. It doesn't always, well, you have many different avenues to look at carbon. You look at biodiversity, you look at production, fish yield probably, and these do not always go in the same direction. And so society have to, in the end, decide what are co-benefits and what do we want to optimize here. But as a rule of thumb, I would say physical and chemical and biological effects are usually, or methods are additive, and you get into trouble or can get into trouble if you combine different chemical effects, different chemical methods, or different biological methods at the same time in the same region.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question by Miriam Bleklogu, and she's wondering whether ocean alkalization can trigger earthquakes through changing huge masses of from the Earth. And she also says life depends on weathering of rock slowly over 1 million of years. Don't we upset this by removing large masses of rocks?
Yeah, interesting. Earthquakes, of course, if you change, well, even melting glaciers have been shown to produce earthquakes. And so if you remove mountains, that might also trigger earthquakes. However, the total amount of rock, so 2 times the Matterhorn every year, that's about what we mine today already. So coal mostly, sand a lot, and some rocks for minerals as well. So it's not unusual. It's not a different quantity. It's just a different quality of rock. I think if we stop coal mining and do rock mining for ocean alkalinity enhancement, we wouldn't need more rock. So this is not a new activity. You can even use the same machinery in many places, and the same workforce as well, so which always has been a big argument, and then like stopping coal in Germany at least, that you want to protect the coal workers, coal miners. Now they can become rock miners using the same equipment. So I don't think this would be a major issue, the earthquake risk that is similar. However, the speed, of course, if you enhance weathering by a factor of 100 about, that's what we need to have a significant impact on climate. That could be very critical. And then it depends how concentrated do you apply the alkalinity or the rock powder. Do you do it local in a concentrated way in a few regions, or do you distribute it globally? And these are issues we don't know yet very well. Usually it's cheaper if you do it locally in concentrated ways, so economics comes into play, but it might be safer, it's almost certainly safer for the ecosystem if you distribute it and apply it over large areas and very dilute rock powder concentrations or alkalinity concentrations. And this is something we have to study, I think, to better understand the ecological imprint. I wouldn't say it's more dangerous than natural weathering, because if you just add pure alkalinity, it would only compensate the CO2 that we like right now impose from the atmosphere to the ocean. So it would be a chemical neutralization of carbonic acid, and therefore it would really reduce the harm we apply by adding CO2 rather than do something completely new perturbation.
Okay. Miriam is also wondering about artificial upwelling and wants to know how this might affect biodiversity in the ocean as it increases nutrients in the surface ocean.
Yes, I think that's very similar to, for biodiversity, it doesn't matter where the nutrients come from, whether they come from the ocean interior where you deploy them from a ship. It's just cheaper to use the nutrients that are already in the ocean. So there's huge biodiversity issues, of course. And that's what you want. I mean, if you want to fertilize, to grow more algae, to suck up more CO2, you will change the ecosystem, you will change biodiversity. And there's always winners and losers. Usually there's some fast-growing winners and some slow-growing losers. And so biodiversity is certainly changed. That's part of the exercise. That's a goal of the operation, really, to change biodiversity, change the system so that biology can take up more CO2. And that makes it difficult to get permits probably for such operations, since there's always NGOs or people who want to protect biodiversity or some species that are then perceived as losers. And this makes it so difficult, I think, for biological operations. And it might be easier to get permits or acceptance for chemical or physical systems.
Mm-hmm. Jens Müller is asking, in the Baltic Sea, we observe increasing alkalinity for more than 2 decades now. This could be a positive feedback to increasing atmospheric CO2, i.e. the natural version of ocean alkalinity enhancement. Similar processes were observed in several other places. Question to you, have you ever tried to model how long it would take until such processes could have a significant impact on the atmospheric CO2 trajectory? And if yes, what's the outcome of those model exercises?
Yes, we have tried it for the global ocean. So right now we think the Baltic Sea, it's not, as far as I know at least, it's not fully understood where this alkalinity increase comes from. Most likely it comes from enhanced weathering on land, maybe by anthropogenic perturbations. It comes mostly from the Russian rivers, I think. But this is much larger than any alkalinity increase we see in the global ocean right now. But if we apply an increase in weathering or alkalinity runoff from land, that is increasing with global temperatures, it's also increasing with atmospheric CO2 levels, that's likely, and put that into our models, the effect is unfortunately very small. It's just an acceleration by maybe a factor of 2 of the total weathering that we expect for the end of the century, when temperatures rise by 4 degrees in the business as usual scenario. So acceleration by a factor of 2, well, removes CO2, 2 times as quickly as the natural weathering process, but it still would take then not 100,000 years, but 50,000 years to come back to pre-industrial concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it really doesn't help society significantly, unfortunately.
And there's a question on blue carbon by Pablo Urrutia Cordero. And he's wondering how is generally perceived the implementation of blue carbon strategies for biodiversity conservation? would these strategies be implemented as monocultures dominated by specific species, those that are good for carbon storing? Could this bring side problems by diminishing local diversity or enter into conflict with conservation strategies of certain endangered species?
Yes, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, certainly. It will also change if you plant a mangrove forest or whatever. It will change biodiversity. That's the goal of the operation. So far, this is usually viewed very positively. So even Germany funds many projects where we grow mangroves, and in Indonesia, in Colombia, and this is our environmental, or it's development aid. There are also private programs to do that. But society tends to view that positively. So you can even buy certificates to grow mangroves or offset your flight emissions. You can also grow swamps somewhere else. But these are systems we tend to view positive as positive perturbations of the system. But in fact, what happens is a huge perturbation of biodiversity, and I think right now about 90% of the mangroves that are planted every year die within 1 or 2 years. So there are huge difficulties how to do it properly, so that in the end you don't do more harm. You end up with a dead mangrove forest where you maybe have had some coastal seagrass ecosystem before. So there's a huge potential to destroy things if you don't do it properly. Right now, there's no regulation for blue carbon. This is completely in the hand of local authorities. So there's no international agreement. There's not even an international definition of blue carbon. So every state, even local communities can decide what to do with their coastal areas. And we have many examples where blue carbon approaches have gone very wrong, where you basically destroyed what was there and then end up with a dead mangrove forest. This is pretty unfortunate. But now that there are initiatives, and we watch them carefully as well, to develop guidelines, what you have to look for, what you should monitor, and in the end, how do you account, even for the carbon stored? It's not clear. Most of the carbon is not stored in the trees, but it's stored in the sediments. And these have to be sampled. You have to know what was there before, what is there after you change the system. And you really have to make sure that in the end you store more carbon and you do not release carbon by destroying one system and replacing it by a different one. This is a very tricky thing. And it's tricky, particularly because it's in usually national waters, national territories. That makes it difficult to have international observers there and have a pretty clear, objective accounting scheme. Where the open ocean is easier, aerophilization has been easy because nobody really can do it on the coast. But the open ocean is much easier to give access to everybody who wants to look there. But in coastal areas, it's difficult because of national interest, military use, and whatsoever, fisheries and local communities who don't want to have observers running around measuring carbon.
Yeah, it sounds like blue carbon is certainly more controversial and more difficult than typically perceived in the public. There's a question by Jens Niesgaard. He says, instead of cooling the surface waters, what about heating the deep water through gigantic heat exchangers?
Well, that's heating the ocean. Why would we want to heat the ocean? I don't quite understand. Well, heating first is the most expensive thing energetically. What you can do, heating or cooling. It's not really feasible. You need so much energy, which we don't have. We rather should make sure we have renewable energy available to run our business, our life. So there's no leftover energy to heat or cool the ocean. And Maybe I didn't get the question right.
Well, I mean, obviously, artificial upwelling also heats the deep ocean. If you bring warm surface water deeper down in the ocean and bring cold deep water up, then you also heat the ocean. I mean, the extra heat that is taken up goes into the deep ocean. So I guess Jens's idea is just, can we speed this up even further so the ocean takes up more of that heat?
Yes, we could, but that's even more dangerous for the overturning circulation. So that shouldn't be done. The overturning circulation depends on stratification, and I think that would be pretty dangerous. What might be interesting is to take out that deeper ocean heat by heat exchangers again, have heat pumps that sequester the heat that is otherwise pumped down by the artificial upwelling, or by the counter flow generated by artificial upwelling. I think this is what like thermal energy plants can do and have looked at as well. So of Hawaii, for example, so to use the heat stored in the ocean in heat pumps, that is still, I think, something feasible that could reduce this physical problem of upsetting the overturning, of the stratification and the overturning circulation. This is possible, and you're gonna left with a salt or salinity stratification problem. That's a little bit trickier because mass really is involved, not only heat flow. But I think there are some maybe ways to really reduce this physical problem in artificial upwelling by making sure you don't deposit heat in the upper ocean, but use it to heat buildings or whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. There's a question by Javier Aristegu. He's wondering, governance is probably a critical handicap in terms of applying CO2 removal strategies. Do you think we must wait to reach agreements at international level, or rather should we look to reach agreements at national or regional level in order to test and apply different strategies?
Well, to test, we may not need international agreements. So and that's, I think, where like mesocosm work is very attractive. They can test many things without upsetting the global ocean in enclosed systems, where you may have to discuss how to dispose the water after the end of the experiment. But that's really what can be I think the only thing that is critical in the end. If you want to deploy carbon dioxide or marine carbon dioxide removal systems really at a scale that are relevant for climate, I think we need international agreements. Otherwise, it cannot be done. It should not be done, because many things can go wrong. The ocean is globally connected. It will affect other people, and it can be very critical for living conditions or economic conditions of other states. Very easily, if fishes, if water quality is concerned, if water chemistry is an issue. So I think this should not be done without international agreement. And I think we are in a good position because we have the London Convention, and that's much advanced compared to terrestrial systems even. So the ocean is better governed than the land. Land is always nationally owned, so nobody would like to have other states have a say whether to plant a forest or not. But still, if Russia does afforestation and plants forests everywhere, and the planet will get hotter, other states and people will be harmed. And that climate engineering on land or CO2 removal on land is an issue that would need international agreement. And there the ocean should be a role model, I think. And we have the starting point of the London Convention that can be easily expanded. And we have working groups that look at that right now. How should the London Convention be? What amendments do we need to really govern other marine carbon dioxide removal approaches? And I think this is a huge chance that the global society has, really, because the ocean is so far away from all national interests, or most national interests. It might be easier to use that as a role model, and we should definitely strive to use that. That's a good starting point. And I think this is needed. We can, if one country now starts deploying marine carbon dioxide removal without international agreements, we would destroy or could destroy this London Convention scheme and this very good, well, starting point of really a global agreement scheme that probably will be necessary to remove that much CO2, these 670 gigatons that we will have to do by the end of the century. So please don't do marine carbon dioxide removal without international consideration. I think it shouldn't be too difficult once we know what is at stake and once we have good scientific understanding. But I think it's a prime example of how the things should be done, and we can probably use that to even speed up things on the terrestrial side as well, which will be required there as well if things are scaled up to have climate relevance.
Great. I think that's a nice final statement, rounding up what we've heard and discussed so far. We've already bought into the World Cafe session by over 20 minutes now. So I'd like to close the question and answer session here. I'd like to thank Andreas very much for a very inspiring and nice summary talk on the options we have. I mean, it was a clear message. I think there's a lot of research, a lot of international coordination, a lot of cross-disciplinary coordination needed here to make progress, and we don't have much time to get this on the road. Within the next 10 years, we will have to provide the guidance to the decision makers on what approaches are useful and which are not. With that, thank you again, Andreas. Thank you for everyone who was online. Thank you for those who participated in the question and answer session. And I will close this session here, and I will see all those of you who have registered for the World Cafe in, let's say, 2 or 3 minutes at the other link that we have provided you. And there we will start with the questions of the World Cafe. So thank you again, Andreas. Have a great afternoon, and you have a great final part of your vacation on Sylt with your family.
Thanks.
Thank you very
Sorry
much.
for the slow start. Yeah, that was.
No problem. Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.